Hello, everyone. Welcome to our virtual lunch hour. My name is Jillian Graber. I'm Executive Director of Protect PT. Thanks so much for joining us again today. We have with us a special guest, George Alexander. He's the author of DragonPipe Diaries, and we're going to be talking about the Mariner East pipeline today. And a couple things really prompted this to come up. So please, we're gonna take questions. We are going to take questions towards the end of the presentation. If you have questions, please chat them in the chat box on your YouTube. And you can go ahead and chat them at any time. And then I can pop them up towards the end and make sure that George can answer all the questions that you have. But we're going to be talking about if you're in the blast zone and what that means, and what the blast zone of Mariner East is, because a lot of people might not know that. And so we're going to talk a lot about the safety concerns with Mariner East. So like I said, if you have questions, let us know. And hello, George. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Julian. Pleasure to be here. I'm grateful for the invitation from you and Protect PT, and look forward to getting people more familiar with Mariner East and the risks associated with it. Today, I'm going to be talking almost exclusively about risk. There are a variety of other things about Mariner East that are undesirable that I could talk about, and I'm happy to entertain questions at the end about them, but I won't be talking about fracking and the related issues. I won't be talking about the environmental problems of constructing the pipeline, which continue to be a major issue in southeastern PA. I won't be talking about property rights abuses and eminent domain and some of the problems that have been associated with that, or the production of plastic, which is the main purpose ultimately of this pipeline. And I won't be talking about the fraud against energy transfer investors that there are some lawsuits about. All of that stuff, to me, is secondary to the issue of risk. So that's what I will be talking about. And as Jillian says, we'll take questions at the end, and if you have questions on some of those areas, be glad to address them. But for right now, let's talk about risk. And in order to talk about risk, I think the place to start is, what is the purpose of this pipeline? If you drill for natural gas in Western Pennsylvania, you get a lot of other gas besides methane, natural gas. The primary ones are ethane, propane, and butane. All of those gases have to be extracted from the natural gas, and you have to do something with them. They are sufficiently flammable that if they were left in the natural gas, then the gas would burn too much and damage equipment. So it must all be removed. Cryogenic plants are used to remove it because those other gases will liquefy at very cold temperatures, and the natural gas will not. So that's how you get it out. And then what do you do with it? It's very difficult to deal with. That you can't allow it to regasify because it becomes a real problem for containment. So you have to keep it either under pressure or very cold, and to keep it in liquid form. Now, and there's no natural market for most of it in that part of Pennsylvania. So what do you do? Well, it turned out that there was a good market for ethane, which is the highest volume of these products, in Europe, because Europe had a lot of ethane that was from the North Sea that had dwindled off, and refineries there needed ethane to make plastic with, because that's virtually the only thing you can do with ethane. How do you get it to Europe? Well, it turned out that Energy Transfer, which had purchased Sunoco, had gotten, along with that purchase, an old pipeline for sending refinery products west from the Philadelphia area. They reversed the pipeline. So this is a pipeline from the 1930s. They reversed the pipeline and repurposed it to send these gases east, back to Marcus Hook, where there's a port where ships could come in and take this gas to Europe. And they found a customer in a big petrochemical company called INEOS, which commissioned a fleet of 8 ships. Now there are 9 now, to take this gas away and primarily take it to 2 refineries that INEOS owns in Scotland and Norway to make plastic there. Along the way, they convinced the powers that be that they had public domain status because the old oil pipeline had that status, and they claimed it was still the same thing. They claimed that building 2 additional pipelines alongside the old one was merely an expansion, and therefore those were also public utilities, and that has led to the eminent domain problems that I'm sure you've heard about. So that's the history of the pipeline and what it's for. Now let me turn to the risks. These gases, as I said, they have to be kept in compressed form. Otherwise, they are too hard to transport. And so there's high pressure throughout the pipeline. It's generally on the order of 1,000 pounds per square inch, can be as low as 500, depending on where it is relative to the pumping station. But it's high pressure, and therefore, if there's a break, a leak of some kind, it escapes and forms a cloud. And a serious breach of this type of pipeline could kill dozens of people or hundreds of people, depending on where it occurred. And I'd like to stress that this is not like a leak of natural gas. Natural gas does form an explosive cloud, and so do these other gases. But unlike natural gas, they're heavier than air, so they spread out along the ground and cover a large area. And this illustration shows a test that I conducted with some modeling software. This was modeling software that was used in a risk assessment that was called the Citizens Risk Assessment, that was done in conjunction with this pipeline in Chester and Delaware County. And this shows under the identical conditions with a 12-inch pipe, the size of the flammable cloud that would be formed with methane, ordinary natural gas, and propane. Now, this was the worst case because this was under relatively calm conditions, but you can see this is a huge cloud, 1,500 feet from the point of the rupture, and equally wide in the other direction. Beyond that, the cloud will dissipate to the point that it's no longer flammable. But within that cloud, which is like fog along the ground, the whole cloud is flammable, and if it encounters an ignition source, it all burns at once in a matter of seconds. And if you're in that cloud when that happens, you die. There's basically no possibility of escape. And the cloud forms very quickly. You can't outrun it. It has no odor. It's invisible except for if it comes out cold, so it may condense water that's in the air. You might get some fog from that, but you can't see the material. This example is propane, but butane and ethane give very similar diagrams to this one. So what this is saying is, you see the little orange patch near the leak where the methane danger is. That's tiny because methane rises and disperses. The propane cloud is huge because it spreads along the ground, and it doesn't disperse very readily. So under many conditions, these gases are exposing an area that is dozens or hundreds of times larger than the corresponding natural gas leak. So if you think of, for example, the Beaver County explosion of the Revolution pipeline a year and a half ago or whatever it was, that was dangerous enough, and it took out one family's home. But think about what would happen with a leak, the corresponding leak with this material. It would take out an entire neighborhood. So that's where the risk comes from. What might cause a leak in a pipeline? Well, there are several reasons it could leak. One is corrosion. We're talking about a pipeline from the 1930s. It has already leaked. And in fact, there was a potentially serious leak in Morgantown, not too far from where I am. And it turned out that the Public Utility Commission investigated it and found it was from faulty maintenance. And they found that the same faulty maintenance could have occurred anywhere along the 350 miles of this pipeline. And basically, that's a problem with an old pipeline. It rusts away if you don't maintain it properly. And this was not properly maintained. Could be happening anywhere. It could be all along the pipeline. I could talk more about that if people want to know more about that, but let's move on to the next possibility, bad welding. If you don't properly weld these pipelines, the high pressures involved will cause problems. And there have been problems with some of these pipelines. And recently there was a case where a weld inspector, actually from Westmoreland County, who pled guilty to filing 77 records of welds that he claimed to have inspected and found them good, when in fact they were bad, and he had substituted the records for good welds. He pled guilty a month or so ago. He's not yet been sentenced. We don't know what will happen with that. There have been failed welds on other energy transfer pipelines, welds by unapproved and uncertified technicians, welds by uncertified welders in Texas. And there's been allegations that bad welds were one of the factors in the Revolution explosion in Beaver County. So is this just a problem in Southeast Pennsylvania, where it goes right through suburban areas? And the answer is, of course, no, it's not. So let me show you what it might look like here in Westmoreland County. If we could go back to the diagram showing that. Yeah, that's the one. So this shows, so the red line that runs from the top to the bottom of this picture is the pipeline route. And I've just picked an arbitrary point near the bottom there of where there could be a rupture. Could be one of the reasons that I mentioned, or could be a backhoe hitting it. Could be a land shift from some kind of landslide or whatever. There's a lot of reasons you could get a pipeline problem. In this case, I'm showing an area where the lower part of this oval is where a new residential development is being proposed. What the oval is the maximum extent of a possible rupture in the pipeline as determined by Delaware County's risk assessment. Delaware County hired a firm to do an assessment of this pipeline. And I pulled the shape and size of that white cloud there from that risk assessment. So you can see it would cover, and this is purely arbitrary, the direction of that oval would depend on the local wind conditions and so forth. But you can see that if it happened to be like this, then there would be dozens and dozens of homes that are already constructed that would be within this flammable cloud, because that outline is the flammable cloud, and the new residences that are proposed down at the bottom would also be within it, and various commercial buildings and so forth. So this is the kind of thing that could happen anywhere along the 350 miles that we're discussing with this pipeline. So what are we going to do then about these risks? Sunoco will tell you about risk detection. And what they do is they monitor the pressure in the pipeline remotely. And if it changes too much, if it drops too much, then they know they have a leak. Then they would send out a team to try to determine, because these measurements are mainly made at valve stations, which are typically 7 miles apart. So you know you have a leak somewhere in 7 miles. Send out a team, try to locate the location of the leak, and then see about turning off the appropriate valve and notifying authorities. Well, this doesn't happen actually in practice. There have been leaks on a variety of energy transfer pipelines, and I think other companies have the same problem. And they aren't caught by changes in pressure, because changes in pressure are normal in these pipelines. A 10% change in pipeline pressure is a very common event, and it happens because valves are opening and closing, new bits of gas are being added or taken out. That's absolutely standard. And yet, if you were to have a leak and it lost 10% of the contents of the pipeline, it wouldn't be detected, but it would be a very serious explosion hazard. So that method of detection by monitoring pressure turns out not to be the way leaks are discovered. The Morgantown leak that I mentioned before, for example, was discovered by a landowner finding some strange stuff bubbling up from the ground in his yard. And he was alert enough to notify the authorities and get the pipeline shut down until it could be fixed. And that is typical. In most cases, the company doesn't identify the problem. People observe it and report it, and that's how it gets learned about. So there is no leak detection that is worthwhile, and therefore no possibility of warning. And in the case of a real rupture with serious release, warning would be almost useless anyway, because you have a very few minutes, maybe 5 minutes, to get out of there before that explosive cloud forms. And there's no way to get that word out. And you can't use a car to get away. Basically, Sunoco has not come up with a plan that makes any sense for dealing with an emergency. Their only advice is leave the area on foot, go uphill and upwind, because the cloud would tend to go downhill and downwind, and don't use any source of ignition. So that means you don't use a car, you don't use a flashlight, you don't ring a doorbell, you don't use a garage opener. Even cell phones are claimed to be a possible ignition source. It's uncertain whether that's true. So it's unrealistic, especially for the very old and the very young. And it's unrealistic during certain kinds of weather conditions. And it all depends on people knowing that a release has occurred, but there is no way to know that a release has occurred. So it's a totally inadequate plan. And the Delaware County emergency management authorities have basically said, yeah, there's no way we can ensure anybody's safety under these conditions. So where does that leave us? Well, what we need to do is we need to have better regulation of pipelines, and if they can't be made to operate safely, they need to be shut down. So how does that happen? There's two avenues, really. There's the legal route and there's a regulatory route. And things are happening in both of those avenues. And let me just briefly list some of the important things that are going on. I feel like it's hard for me to say that I'm optimistic about getting some of these changes made, but it's essential if we're not to flirt with a catastrophe here. So first of all, the legal system. We do have an FBI investigation going on, we hear. We have the Attorney General convening a grand jury. The grand jury has done a little bit with fracking and will, we believe, be doing some things with pipelines as well, possibly with Mariner. Looking forward to that. There have been a few cases in the courts that could have importance. For example, Concerned Citizens of Lebanon County has a case where zoning irregularities permitted Sunoco to build a pumping station in their county illegally, and it remains to be seen what will happen with that case. That case was upheld. The finding that it was illegal was upheld by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. So it's moving in the right direction. It hasn't been totally resolved yet. On the other side, you have regulation. The main regulatory body is the Public Utility Commission. They have the responsibility for making public utilities, including pipelines, safe. And it was their Bureau of Investigation and Enforcement that took on the case of the Morgantown leak and caused Sunoco to agree to a settlement there that will require them to take a lot better care of their old pipelines than they had been. Exactly how that will work out in practice remains to be seen, but we should be getting periodic reports, public reports on the work that results from that. The most hopeful thing currently with the Public Utility Commission is a case called Safety 7. It was brought by 7 residents of Delaware and Chester County. And there are 2 aspects to that case. One is Sunoco is required to have a credible safety plan, and they don't. And the other is Sunoco is required to properly maintain their pipelines, and they don't. That has been making its way through the PUC process, and the final hearings will be in the fall, September and October. And so we should have some kind of a decision on that before the end of the year. That could be a very important case, assuming the Safety 7 prevails, and we'll see. But the testimony on that in the fall will be critical. That's where the Safety 7 complainants will have their expert witnesses, and Sunoco will have their expert witnesses, and they'll both be trying to convince the judge of their side of the case. That's becoming, or has become, a very expensive proposition for the 7 people who are complaining, because it turns out that the expert witnesses they need are very expensive. I'll say more about that at the end. That process is called a formal complaint. There's one other process that the PUC offers if you have a problem like this. It's called an emergency petition. And Senator Dinniman, who represents part of Chester County, tried to file an emergency petition. I guess it was about a year ago, and Sunoco managed to get it bottled up in the courts, and then managed to get his standing disputed in such a way that nothing came of it. But I think there is good grounds for an emergency petition because there is an imminent danger from this pipeline. If somebody does file an emergency petition, the process is much quicker than the formal complaint that the Safety 7 is going through. So it gets resolved within a month or so, a month or 6 weeks. And that could be extremely important if it happens. And there has been talk that emergency petitions might be filed. And I hope that it happens.
Okay. Thank you, Joe.
So that's kind of general situation with regulation and with the legal situation. That's the situation with Mariner. The other pipeline that does exactly the same thing, it carries ethane, is the Falcon pipeline under construction in Western Pennsylvania. This is a pipeline intended to bring ethane to the new Shell cracker plant. And again, this is plastic production that we're talking about. Falcon is even worse than Mariner in some respects because it is a larger diameter pipe than any of the three that are involved in Mariner. It also has the same issues with potential problems like the one that that the Revolution pipeline suffered from, going through relatively difficult terrain to build in. So I think Falcon will face the same kinds of hurdles that we have faced with Mariner. And I hope that some of the history that we've developed and some of the information that we know from Mariner will help the people fighting Falcon. So what do you do? If you are interested in helping stop this pipeline, and this would apply equally to any other pipeline by and large, the first thing to do, I would say, is to make sure that your first responders, so your police, your fire, your EMT folks, your county emergency management folks, that those folks are aware of the special dangers associated with this type of pipeline, because it turned out in our area that they weren't. That's important. And then you can educate your representatives in Harrisburg about what this, how dangerous this is and why something needs to be done. And they can help with better pipeline regulations. And finally, I would suggest you might want to contribute to Safety 7. Safety 7 is the PUC case that I mentioned before. It's the one with the most promise of helping address this pipeline problem. And they have a GoFundMe. If you go to GoFundMe and search for Safety 7, you'll find it. And I believe it is going to be put up on the chat as well here. And so that's a great opportunity to help this cause along. And with that, I think I've covered the basics, and I would like to hear questions from you folks.
Great. Thank you, George. So we do have a couple questions, and I hope we don't get cut off short here because my laptop is losing steam. But I did put the Safety 7. Mary was kind enough to put the link in the chat. We also have a link about the legislators, as you were talking about, George. We have a link to all the legislators in all the counties for that Mariner East traverses in Pennsylvania. And we're also developing with Halt the Harm Network a kind of a campaign to let those first responders know. And I agree. We have been working on our hazard mitigation plan here in Westmoreland County, and our first responders, when we initially came to them and said, "Hey, there should be a larger evacuation area, around this pipeline," they took our consideration or took our recommendations because they didn't know that there were so many sources of infrastructure and sources of potential hazards within Westmoreland County. And it's important when they're making their hazard mitigation plans every couple years that they account for these things. And many times the county is not in sync with what's going on at the state level as far as these major infrastructure projects are happening. So it's important that we show those first responders that we can support them through giving them the information that will help them do their job better. So we're committed to doing that here at Protect PT, and I think that it would be a great way for us to help protect the people across Pennsylvania. We have two questions. The first is from Lois. She says, "Is there a compiled list so that the citizens might identify any vehicles who are contracted to work on the pipelines along the 350 miles?" So, George, do you have any comment on that?
Well, I guess what that question brings up is most of the people that you will see doing work along the pipeline are contractors. They're not Sunoco employees. And Sunoco has several different contractors they've used on different parts of the pipe. Mostly, if you see out-of-state plates from Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana, Oklahoma, those are some of the folks that are doing most of the pipeline work now. There's been, at least in our area, very little local employment. Welding, yes, a little bit of excavation, but and flaggers directing traffic. But apart from those, it's been out-of-state workers. In terms of who the local contractors might be, whose trucks you see in your local area, that I really could not address.
Okay. We also have another question from Diane. I am in the blast zone where here in West Whiteland. I am very scared to say the least. Should I sell my home or move? I really feel that it comes down to money, and don't we can stop it. So I think she's asking, how can we stop it? So I think that just to kind of answer that a little bit, and George, you can give an answer as well. The first thing is awareness to the rest of the public, which is what this presentation serves. And we also have a Halt Mariner Now page, which we put up earlier. So I think that awareness to the public, and then to the legislators that allowed this to happen. Part of the Halt Mariner Now campaign was to let Governor Wolf know how many people were really concerned about the pipeline, but we haven't seen any kind of movement on that. So that's really disappointing. George, do you have anything to say about that?
So obviously everybody has to make their own decisions about how close to the pipeline they're willing to live. And this question comes up a lot. And it really has had an unfortunate negative impact on property values all along the pipeline, especially in the Philadelphia suburbs. Um, I don't I don't really have advice for you, but the only thing I can say is um, think about, on the one hand, yes, these leaks are unlikely, but they do happen. And think about how you would feel, or if you were one of the victims, how the people in your family would feel if a leak did occur where you are. It could be a very good reason to leave the area. Some people have, um, and could be a good reason not to buy near the pipeline. And that has happened too. And I know of cases in both categories. Um, I think the key thing to do if you're living near the pipeline right now, though, is throw whatever support you can behind the efforts to shut it down.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a good point. We have another question. Why aren't pipelines like these federally regulated if they're shipping products overseas? And
You-
I might lose you if I do. Just we'll try to keep the chat going.
So yeah, a good question. There is no federal regulation of this pipeline because somehow Sunoco managed to get it classified as an intrastate pipeline, specifically within Pennsylvania, although it does bring material out of West Virginia and out of Ohio, and it does ship internationally. So I I feel like that was a clever lawyerly move that someone made, and we need to look again at the regulations that permitted that to happen.
Yeah. And I am getting I'm having some problems with my laptop, so I apologize, everyone. If we do not get a chance to continue this conversation now, I would say just make sure you go to Dragon Pipeline Diary and connect with George. He's got a lot of great information because I think my laptop is doing some crazy things. I also want to mention that the Safety 7 is going to be up on the chat, the GoFundMe. So make sure that you support those folks because they're really working hard to make sure many people in Pennsylvania have a safer backyard. And so if you go to the next screen really quick, we had some other questions, George. I don't know if you're able to chat the answers to them in the chat on
Oh,
our YouTube. But if you're subscribed to our YouTube, that will actually will allow you to see future lunch hours. And I apologize for the technical problems today. I'm not really sure what's going on with the laptop, but we'll get that figured out. And if you would like to fill out our survey for our lunch hour, there's a link to the survey. And if you want to see some topics that are going to be coming up here again, please do so. Please let us know what topics you'd like to see. And next week, we're actually going to have Berks Gas Truth, Karen Faradin from Berks Gas Truth and the Better Path Coalition on our lunch hour. My screen is frozen, so I'm not able to scroll the questions like I was. But Nancy says that Tetra Tech has 2 contractors, and you may see some of these trucks, but they're unmarked vehicles, including the security vehicles. There was another question from John, and I believe it was when is this pipeline construction going to end, or when will it be completed? While we still have the ability to stream, do you want to talk about that a little bit, George? Do you know anything about that?
yes, I would be glad to. So every conference call that Energy Transfer does for its investors, it predicts that the pipeline will be completed in about 9 more months. And it's been saying that for a couple of years. And that continues to be the case. There are still 10 significant stretches of pipeline in Chester and Delaware County that are not complete, 3 of which have serious geological problems to overcome. It's unclear that they will be able to complete it. They're saying that that most of it will be done the end of this year and some of it early next year. I don't think that's the case. They have never been able to complete anything on time so far. And there are a lot of reasons for thinking that they will still have struggles. So it's supposed to be complete in 2021. And your guess is as good as mine when it actually will be complete.
Great. And there's another question while we're still able to stream. I would like to hear George's thoughts on the underlying soil erosion in sinkholes.
Right. So that's one of the main environmental problems that we've been having here in southeastern PA, constant sinkhole problems and a lot of runoff